Jean-Paul Sartre's play, No Exit, is one of the classics of existential literature. And what's going on in there is he's illustrating, using these three main characters who we'll talk about in a moment, some of the main themes having to do with the nature of the human person and our relations with other people, and about whether in fact we can ever be happy. One of the things that you should ask about this play, and it's sort of an open question, is whether he's attempting to depict the human condition as such, or whether this really is only the bad people that this sort of thing would happen to. And the answer seems to be leaning towards the side of this is the human condition as such, just set in a particularly crystallized manner that allows us to see its features most clearly. It's, as far as plays go, something that very much fits the classical unities, you know, time, setting. The characters themselves, in a certain respect, are unities, as unlike other plays in which characters might actually develop. There's not a lot of development going on. There's just revelation of who these people are. And it is set in such a way as to make it impossible for these characters not to engage each other. So let's look at the characters first, and we're gonna look at these in greater detail and going over some of the key passages. But first we want to get the three actually set up. So at the beginning there's actually what we could call a ancillary character, the valet, who may or may not be one of the devils, certainly works there. He's not part of management, as he says, and he escorts Garcin into this room. And Garcin is a newspaper man from Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. He is a pacifist. Another thing that we can say about him that gets revealed through this is he's also a womanizer. He has interesting relationships with his wife that we'll explore. Another thing that you can say about him from the very beginning is that he's introspective. He is concerned with how he thinks of himself and how other people think of him as well. Then we have Inez. She's the next character to come in, again escorted by the valet, and she is a postal clerk. She's a lesbian, and she describes herself in other people's words, but in words that also seem to fit her own self-conception, as a damned bitch. And she will talk about her cruelty. As a matter of fact, one of the first things that she says that's in the sort of long discourse at the beginning is that she knows what torturers look like because she's seen her own face in the mirror. Then third we have Estelle. And Estelle has died very recently. She's also younger than these other two. She's a person who came from the lower class, or maybe lower middle class, married into the upper class. Kind of a common phenomena in Sartre's own time, as well as still in the present. And she seems very superficial at the beginning. It turns out that there is some depth to her, but it's the more that we go into it, the less you're going to like it. So these three are set up with each other. In a certain way, each of them represents a personality type. Inez is a sadist, but not the kind of sadist who goes about getting people that they can subject to their own whims and wills in a systematic way, just the kind of person who picks constantly. Garcin is somebody who's in delusion about his own status as a man. Estelle is you might say, coquettish. She constantly needs other people to be affirming her own value, and those other people need to be men. And so putting these three together sets up a dynamic, an unstable dynamic, but a dynamic that's always guaranteed to pan out for the worse. Enough, though, to give them hope at certain points. And it's interesting, We see this arise at several different points, the possibility of there being a solution, most often proposed by Garcin, at one point proposed by Inez. I suppose you could see what Estelle is proposing at a certain point as being a kind of solution as well. And all of these come crashing down. And they all come crashing down because of who these people are and the fact that they can't escape each other. So this is a good place to talk about the setting. And I put timelessness there rather than eternity because these characters do exist in time, but it's a time that simply can't end, and it's a time where things begin to lose there's a slippage that's occurring between the time of this place and the time of the world that we know. They're put into a drawing room in Second Empire style, something that we probably, most of us, can't relate to as a description. Just think about, really, I suppose, for imagining this, any sort of gauche, you know, kitschy kind of environment would work, and a drawing room was where you would meet together and talk and you know, do that sort of thing. So it's not a room set up for dinner. It's not a room set up for putting on your makeup. It's not a room set up for, you know, dancing or anything like that. It was very common to have drawing rooms in old-fashioned houses. This is where you might actually meet your guests and sit and talk for a while. And in many places, they would be decorated in a rather overbearing kind of style. And this one seems to be like this. So that's what the place is like. There's actually what, you know, I think Garcin used the word an abomination. There's an abomination on the mantelpiece, which is some brass thing. Much more interesting is the fact that these characters, not only can they not leave the room, although we'll see that there is one opportunity for that, they can't sleep and they can't cry. These are things that the dead no longer can do. As a matter of fact, Garcin observes that they don't even have eyelids. They're not able to blink, they're not able to close their eyes, they're not able to change their condition in any way. And the crying means that they're unable to make a kind of progress in emotional terms, in relational terms, because to cry means to actually allow there to be some sort of outward sign of the anguish or regret or realization within. They all get there, and each one of them is expecting hell to be hellish. They expect burning coals and pincers and racks and stuff like that. You know, the sort of things that are depicted in cartoons and in old paintings, or, you know, say in traditional writings about hell, like, say, Dante's Inferno. And they're all surprised to find out that there isn't anything like that they're just going to be stuck in this room with each other. So the question then, this is the central preoccupation of the entire book, or the entire play, what makes it hell? What makes this particularly hellish? And the answer that's given at the very, very end is that hell is other people. Now, if you're kind of a misanthropic person, or somebody who's been disappointed all the time, or very irritable, or if you're caught in certain circumstances, if you're, you know, stuck in a culture that is particularly anti-intellectual or anti-artistic, maybe this would, you know, be something that you could identify with right away. And there are passing times where, because of the situation that we're in, you know, imagine getting onto a crowded subway, then you could think, yeah, hell is other people. Or dealing with all sorts of unpleasantness coming from the needs, desires, preoccupations of others, then that makes sense. But is this something that holds, is Sartre trying to say that this is the case for everybody? At that point, we want to ask the question, why? Why is hell other people? And if we look at the characters who finally have this realization, mouthed by Garcin, but assented to by the others, we want to ask, why is this the case? And I think that it's worthwhile to reflect a bit on traditional conceptions of hell. If we get away from the fire and brimstone and eternal physical tortures, and we think about other models of what hell consists in, a lot of theologians have framed hell in terms of separation from God. And you could say, well, that's, maybe you don't like God, so maybe that's not so bad. What would be the problem with it? Well, in hell, you are on your own. If you're cut off from God, and you're cut off from, in some respects, the rest of the world, you're entirely cast upon your own resources, your own memories, your relations with other things. And in hell, you can't change. You can't grow. Now, it's not like purgatory, as say Dante portrayed it, where you are gradually purified of the stains of what you've done wrong, and you become a better person. Once you're in hell, you are stuck with who you are for eternity, and over the course of eternity, whatever illusions you have about the good person that you are, or that you didn't really mean to do this over here, or that if things had just turned out differently here, your great intentions would have been known. All of that gets stripped away from you, and we see that happening over the course of this play in different ways, particularly with Estelle and Garcin. Inez, in a certain way, is somebody who doesn't hope and is already more accommodating towards being in hell, and we'll see why. So I think the next thing that we want to do is look at each of these three characters in turn and think about the kind of person that they are, that's revealed in their discussion with these other people. And what's really noticeable about this is that really no action, no significant action takes place in here. Everything is taking place through words. The first character to scrutinize is this guy, Joseph Garcin, a Brazilian, we assume that he's Brazilian, newspaper man, meaning somebody who works in the newspaper. He might be a reporter, he might be an editor. All we know is that he spends a lot of time at the office and cares quite a bit about what the people at the office think of him. He is also a pacifist, and we don't really know whether he's a pacifist just by conviction, or whether he is also, and this is something he's very preoccupied with, whether he's also a coward. He's a husband, and we're going to look at that very closely in a moment. And he talks about him as having gotten his wife out of the gutter. He saved her from, the lowest of the lower class. He's also a womanizer. And these are things that we can say about him that he reveals over time. There's other things as well that we would want to say that have to do with his function within the play, that also show us, who he is, because remember, you can't change your character once in hell. So something that you can say about him is that he's rather reflective, and that he's concerned with something like an absolute, like, you could say that he wants to exist in other people's eyes, but he wants to exist in a certain way. He wants to be seen as a tough guy, as a real man, and he also wants to be seen as somebody who is worthy of love. And we'll get to that dynamic in a bit. So let's look at each of these in turn. Quite a bit of the play, he's talking, all the other characters can see what's going on in the world that they've left. And he is alternating between what's going on at the newspaper office and what's going on with his wife, who is trying to find out what's happened to him. He was shot as a deserter. by a firing squad, and they don't let his wife know for some time, and then they finally give his shirt to her, full of bullet holes and blood, and that's how she finds out. So all of these things actually end up getting tied together, at least the newspaper man, pacifist, and husband. How so? Well, it's because he's a pacifist that when he is conscripted, he leaves. He flees. He gets on a train to go to Mexico, where his intention, according to him, is to start a pacifist newspaper. That's at least what he's telling himself, and what he tells his fellow residents in hell for a while. But he's not quite sure whether that truly was what was on his mind, or whether he's really just a coward. He gets caught, and they bring him back, and they execute him by firing squad, and he says, if I could just be courageous at that moment, and we don't know exactly what happens, but he doesn't show courage. Perhaps he wets his pants or something along those lines, and then his life ends. His wife is left in the lurch, trying to figure out what happened to her husband for quite a while, and he's not particularly caring about what has happened to his wife. He seems much more interested in whether he really was a good man or whether he was a coward. There's a set of passages that are particularly revealing, I think, where he talks about his relationship with his wife, and he says, "Why am I here? It's not because I was a deserter, it's not because I was a coward, I'm here because I treated my wife abominably. That's all. For 5 years, naturally, she's suffering still. There she is, the moment I mention her, I see her." And he goes through, talking about how she's, there with the shirt, and she's not crying. And he says, "No, you can't shed a tear, my love. Surely you'll squeeze one out at last. No, you can't manage it. Night after night I came home blind drunk, stinking of wine and women. She'd sat up for me, of course, but she never cried, never uttered a word of reproach. Only her eyes spoke, big, tragic eyes. I don't regret anything. I must pay the price, but I shan't whine. It's snowing in the street. Won't you cry?" And he goes on with that. And Inez asks, "Why did you hurt her like that?" And remember, Inez is herself kind of a sadist, so it's not clear why she's asking. And Garcin says, because it was so easy. A word was enough to make her flinch. I'm fond of teasing. I watched and waited. And so, what else did he do? There's another incident that he brings up that shows you, what a womanizer he was. Here's something you can get your teeth into. I brought a half-caste girl to stay in our house. My wife slept upstairs. She must have heard everything. She was an early riser, and as I and the girl stayed in bed late, she served us our morning coffee. And then Inez says, "You brute," and he says, "Yes, a brute if you like, but a well-beloved brute." So he doesn't really have any regrets over what he thinks landed him in hell. And nobody ever actually says, yes, this is exactly why you are being sentenced. It could be because he was a coward. It could be because he was in what Sartre calls bad faith, this condition where a human being essentially lies to themselves and tells themselves that there's something other than they are, usually something better than they are, that they're not responsible for the kind of behavior that they engage in, the kind of person that they've become, that circumstances forced it, that they didn't have a choice. When Sartre's philosophy says we always do have a choice, and you can say that for Sartre, we have a duty to actually explore who we are, our structures of motivation, why we make the decisions that we do, and if we find things in ourselves that are reprehensible or unsavory, to try to correct those if we can. Garcin doesn't do that. Instead, he keeps on, you might say, raising the stakes. he flees rather than going to war, and he says, it's because I'm a pacifist, so I'm really a hero. I'm standing up for my values, my principles. But then it turns out maybe he isn't, and he ends up, you know, asking later on. He's showing some qualms, and he's talking with Estelle, and we'll talk more about why he's doing this. He says, here we go. He asks, am I a coward? And she says, how can I say? Don't be so unreasonable, darling. I can't put myself in your skin. You must decide that for yourself. That's a very typically Sartrean thing. Each of us has to figure out who we are and what kind of person we are. And he says, I can't decide. Now, to not be able to decide something like that, Sartre would say, is in a certain way to try to, it's a choice to not make a choice. It's a choice to pretend like one can't make a choice. And Estelle says, well, you must remember, you must have had reasons for acting as you did. And he says, yeah, I had reasons. And she says, well, and then he asks the key question, were they the real reasons? And she says, oh, don't worry about all that. And he says, I thought it all out. I wanted to make a stand, but was that my real motive? Was that what I was really doing? And she says, fine, try to be honest with yourself for once. And he says, do I really need you to tell me that? Day and night I paced myself from the window to the door, from the door to the window. I pried into my heart, I sleuthed myself like a detective. By the end of it, I felt I'd given my whole life to introspection. There's that reflectiveness to him as well. But always I harked back to the one thing certain, that I had acted as I did. So motives are harder to figure out. We know what we in fact did, and we know what the effects of it were. We know what the choice in that moment was. He said, I'd taken that train to the frontier. But why? Why did I do that? Finally, I thought, my death will settle it. If I face death courageously, I'm no coward. Turned out that he didn't face death courageously, and now he's in hell, still playing the same game of saying, maybe I can, you know, work this out in some way, so actually I'm not a coward, I'm actually a hero. Part of the reason why it's hell for him is because the other people make it impossible for that to be the case, particularly Inez, but also Estelle. Each in their own way. For Inez, she's ready to pick at him and say, you actually are a coward. You're just lying to yourself. Estelle, in a certain way, is even more cruel by saying, it doesn't matter to me whether you're a coward or not, just whether you kiss well. So what it is that you're really preoccupied with, what your self-image consists in, I don't care about that. What I care about is what you mean to me, what you provide me. Garcin is the person at the end who will actually say hell is other people, and he is the one who, this is probably a key point that's worth actually putting up here, he is the one who's constantly proposing solutions. So in a certain way, he represents a kind of hopefulness, but a hopefulness that is always going to be disappointed and then like collapse in on itself. It doesn't have enough to really see itself through. And he'll propose solution after solution after solution, and we'll look at those. He also comes to realize that they are caught in this, as he puts it, a spider web, where if one of them does something, it affects the others. So that's this character, Joseph Garcin. Next we have Inez Seranno, and she's the one character who early on realizes the condition that they're in. So in many ways, she's trading off between her and Garcin the role of narrating what's truly going on behind the scenes. For her, it's just a suspicion, and it might come out of her own character and what she's projecting onto the world, because she is, rather sadistic, and that lends to her a certain, you might say, paranoia, expecting everybody else to be persecuting her in turn. What we can say about her is that she's a post office clerk, in contrast to the well-off Estelle. She's a lesbian, and this comes out very, very early on. She was in this relationship with this woman, Florence. That we'll discuss in just a moment. And what Sartre does a particularly good job in portraying with her is that when it comes to sexual desire, she feels desire for Estelle. And there's interesting ways in which this is brought out without getting pornographic or even really too explicit. But she also feels a kind of disgust for Garcin and his mannishness. And Garcin, by the way, is the one who Estelle, who Inez desires, she's desiring Garcin, and they almost get it on in front of her. And she's talking, about how disgusting she's finding it at the time. By her own admission, she's cruel. She's a torturer. She's sadistic. She has this desire for Estelle, but does she have a desire for Estelle because she really cares about Estelle? Perhaps not. What's interesting about her desire is that it carries through all the revelations that Estelle makes about who she is. All three of these people realize that they are rotten to the core, to use their own words. And yet she still desires Estelle. She has a feeling for her. And she's the one who realizes their condition. As opposed to Garcin, who says, I can use all this time to sort of put my life in order. Inez will say, well, everything's put in order for me. There's nothing for me to think about. Now the only question is, what am I going to do with this eternity of time in front of me? Let's look at a few passages that I think are particularly important or revelatory. So as soon as she gets in the room, she thinks that Garcin is going to be the torturer. And Garcin says, that's too comic for words. Come on in, have a good look at me. And he says, now that we've broken the ice, do you really think I look like a torturer? By the way, how does one recognize torturers when one sees them? Evidently you've got ideas on the subject. Inez says, they look frightened. And you might say that's a flip comment on Sartre, it's an easy thing to throw in at a time when torture was, in fact, going on in many places. It's the sort of typical thing that an intellectual would say about that. They don't really have guts. He's not going there with this. Garcin says frightened, but how ridiculous. Of whom should they be frightened? Of their victims? And Inez says, laugh away. But I know what I'm talking about. I've often watched my face in the glass. And there's nothing more said there. But what's being hinted at? The one who is cruel to the other person actually is worried about how the other person is going to react, how they're perceiving them. Maybe they're even shocked at what they do to the other person and what the other person endures. A little bit later on, Inez is the one who's willing to sort of call a spade, and she says, yes, we are all criminals, murderers, all three of us. We're in hell, my pets. They never make mistakes, and people aren't damned for nothing. And Estelle doesn't want to hear this. She says, stop, for heaven's sake. And Inez says, in hell, damned souls, that's us, all three. And Estelle says, keep quiet, I forbid you to use such disgusting words. Why talking about disgusting words at that point? Meaning words that we don't want to hear. We don't want to recognize the situation that we're in. And Inez says, a damned soul, that's you, my little plaster saint, and ditto our friend here, the noble pacifist. We've had our hour of pleasure, haven't we? There have been people who burned their lives out for our sake, and we chuckled over it. We didn't appreciate the sacrifice that was made. Notice that she's not just saying that what's bad is that they had other people burn their lives out for their sake, but that they chuckled over it. They didn't appreciate it. They even, in Garcin's case, made light of it. So now we have to pay the reckoning. And then she says, I understand now. I know why they've put us three together. This is a question that they're concerned with throughout the play in the early part. And she says, you'll see how simple it is, childishly simple. Obviously, there aren't any physical torments, and yet we're in hell, and no one will ever come here. We'll stay in this room together, the three of us, forever and ever. In short, there's someone absent here, the official torturer. So, she says, it's obvious what they're after. An economy of manpower, or devil power, if you prefer. It's the same idea as the cafeteria, where customers serve themselves. And Estelle says, what do you mean? And Inez says, I mean that each one of us will act as the torturer of the two others. So she's realized the condition that they're in. She'll talk in other places about each of them being traps laid for the others. For example, because she desires Estelle, Estelle is a trap for her. She can invest her time, her attention, even if she can muster up her love, and by doing so she'll be laying herself in for greater disappointment, greater pain, greater humiliation. And she says to Garcin, there's traps laid for you as well. Each one of us has traps laid for us here that will cause us to be frustrated, cause us to be humiliated, cause us to be confronted with our own condition, who we are, and we'll be confronted with the fact that others are actually seeing us as we are and not happy with it. That we can't, if we say it in very crude terms, we can't put any BS over them. We can tell it to ourselves, but it won't work while they're in the room. She is the one who's probably the most conscious of the presence of the others. She tells Garcin at a certain point that, even if you're quiet, I can hear you over there thinking. This is what we call intentionality in philosophy and phenomenology in particular. And Sartre is putting into Inez's mouth a great speech about intentionality. When we perceive that, even if another doesn't speak, we can perceive their attitudes, we can perceive their intentions, and sometimes we can misperceive these, but very often we can sort of peer into them, at least to a certain depth, sometimes seeing things that they themselves are unaware that they're projecting. Inez is painfully conscious of that. She can't get away from that. Now, how did she end up there? Here's her story. She says, why am I down here? Well, I was what some people down there call a damned bitch, damned already, so it's no surprise being here. She's very cynical, she's unhopeful, she's despairing. And then Garcin says, is that all you have to say? And she says, no, there was that affair with Florence, a dead man's tale, with 3 corpses to it. He to start with, then she and I. So there's no one left. I have no one to worry about. It was a clean sweep. Only that room, I see it now and then, empty with the doors locked. And then, she goes on and Garcin says, did the man kill himself? And she says, he? No, he hadn't the guts for that. Still, he had every reason. We led him a dog's life. As a matter of fact, he was run over by a tram, a silly sort of end. I was living with them. He was my cousin. So what she's done is she's seduced her cousin's wife or girlfriend, and they're sort of, flaunting their affair in front of him. And, apparently at one time she was sort of okay with the cousin, but then she says, I got sick of him, quite gradually. All sorts of little things got on my nerves. For instance, he made a noise when he was drinking, a kind of gurgle. Trifles like that. He was rather pathetic, really. Vulnerable. That shows you, for Inez, if you show weakness, if you show vulnerability, she will go on the attack because that's the kind of person that she is. She tells us this a little bit later. She says, when I say I'm cruel, I mean, I can't get on without making people suffer, like a live coal in others' hearts. When I'm alone, I flicker out. For 6 months, I flamed away in her heart till there was nothing but a cinder. One night, she got up and turned on the gas while I was asleep. Then she crept back into bed, so now you know. So they got her cousin to go out into the street and get run over by a passing tram. And then she just picked and picked and picked at her lover until her lover killed both of them by turning on the gas and going to bed. So Inez, this is what she thinks got her down in hell. But she thinks that she was ready for hell to begin with because of the kind of person that she is. And it's in part because she doesn't have a lot of illusions, because she sees reality as rather unvarnished, although she's probably projecting the hostility that she feels towards others onto others and receiving it back. She's the one who's immediately able to say, here's the problem, here's the trap that we're stuck in. We're going to be torturing each other. And when they say, no, I won't be doing that sort of thing, she says, well, I will, and I bet you will too, because you're not as good as you think, and after a little while with me, you're probably going to want to torture me back too. At the same time, there is one moment where late on in the play, she trusted Garcin about something, and perhaps she's just sort of putting on, she's just engaging in an argumentative move, but perhaps she really is showing a moment of real vulnerability where Garcin has promised that he will help her. Now she's, sort of thrown that back in his face, and then he responds to Estelle, who's trying to seduce him for her own ends, and says, I'm going to go along with this. And she says, you promised me. You promised. And he says, well, you went back on your promise first. There is the one moment where she appears to be really hurt to the core. All the rest of the time, she's more or less frustrated and disgusted. She would like to have Estelle all to herself, and she sort of thinks that were Garcin not in the picture, she could eventually bring Estelle around. Probably not the case, given that they're in hell, but that's one of the things that's motivating her. She admits that she herself is a coward when Garcin says, you and I have something in common. So what we've got here in Inez is somebody who has many fewer illusions than the other two, but has many fewer illusions because she recognizes just what a bastard she is. The third main character comes in not long after the other two, and her name is Estelle Rigaut, and she comes in very worried that she's going to have to confront her ex-lover who had apparently shot himself in the face. And she's surprised to find out that no, she's in with these other two who she has seemingly nothing in common with at all. What can we say about her? Well, she is, in a certain respect, a rags to riches story through marrying an older man. And it's worth sort of spending a little bit of time on that part of her story. She says this early on. She says, I lost my parents when I was a kid, and I had my young brother to bring up. We were terribly poor, and when an old friend of my people asked me to marry him, I said yes. He was very well off and quite nice. My brother was a very delicate child and needed all sorts of attention, so really that was the right thing for me to do, don't you agree? My husband was old enough to be my father, but for 6 years we had a happy married life. Then 2 years ago I met the man I was fated to love. We knew at the moment we set eyes on each other. He asked me to run away with him, and I refused. Then I got pneumonia, and it finished me. That's the whole story. No doubt by certain standards I did wrong to sacrifice my youth to a man nearly 3 times my age. Do you think that could be called a sin? And what's interesting about this is that it shows that she's from the beginning, telling a story that's plausible because it has some elements that are actually truthful, but it's superficial. It's not actually getting at what her real motives were, not even the real facts. She's leaving out some very important facts that are going to surface a bit later. You know there's more to the story because, you know, she's worried about seeing somebody who shot his face off when she comes in. But she's telling this very genteel, another term that I should put in here is she's kind of not only superficial, but she's also, and I'm going to use the word pseudo here, she's a pseudo-romantic. She would like everything to be nice and lovey-dovey, and for her to be the center of courtship and attention. And she tells this story about the self-sacrificing heroine who, to take care of her young, sick brother, marries a man who's much older. But even then, it's still good for 6 years. They love each other. But then she meets the man who, it was in the stars for her to cross paths with and to love, even though, she was already married to somebody else. And she uses this kind of romanticism to justify her choices to do the wrong thing, to cheat, to deceive. And we're going to see this, what's going on with her is gradually all of this is sort of peeled away. And it's peeled away in a different way than it is with Garcin. With Garcin, it's his own sort of questioning, the corrosiveness of his own reflection, aided by Inez, to a lesser extent by Estelle, that tears away the illusions. He's already worried himself about whether he's doing the right thing. Estelle is somebody who almost perfectly exemplifies what Sartre calls bad faith. She could be the woman who he describes in Being in Nothingness, who goes out on a date knowing full well that the guy's going to expect her to put out at the end of the date, and doesn't want to think about that, wants to think he's really a nice guy. And, the guy takes her hand, and she doesn't quite commit to her hand being in his hand, because that would mean that she knows where this is going. But she doesn't pull it away either, because that would also imply that she knows where it's going. Instead, she just kind of leaves it there neutrally and lets things happen until they get to the point of no return, at which point she can say, I didn't know what to do, my hand was forced. Estelle is that kind of person, and yet at the same time she is acting, she is choosing. She's actually in many respects quite manipulative, but disguises this from herself. So she represents a certain character type, you might say. She cheated on her husband. We find that out early on. It's only with a bit more time in, where they start stripping away the blinds, that we find out that she actually killed her baby daughter. That's why she's in hell, not just for, not for making the mistake of marrying not for love, and, to take care of her brother, and not just because she cheated on her husband, but because she killed her own daughter, who is the result of that affair. And they question her. They say, well, you're down here because you had this affair. And she says, that's not it. Finally, she says, you've got it all wrong, you two. He wanted me to have a baby. They were saying you didn't want to be with him because he was poor, and he killed himself because you wouldn't be with him. She says, no, he wanted me to have a baby. And Garcin says, and you didn't want one. And then she says, I certainly didn't. But the baby came. Worse luck. I went to Switzerland for 5 months. No one knew anything. It was a girl. Roger was with me when she was born. It pleased him to no end having a daughter. It didn't please me. So the man who she's cheating with is delighted that they've had this baby together. And you can imagine all sorts of circumstances where maybe he takes the child and goes off somewhere. Instead, I'll tell you in her own words, there was a balcony overlooking the lake. I brought a big stone. He could see what I was up to and kept on shouting, Estelle, for God's sake, don't. I hated him then. He saw it all. He was leaning over the balcony, and he saw the rings spreading out on the water. And then Garcin says, yes, and then? And now notice, there's no remorse there whatsoever. There's no sense that something horrible has happened. She says, I came back to Paris and he did as he wished. And what he wished was to kill himself after that. And he says, Garcin says, you mean he blew his brains out? And Estelle says, it was absurd of him, really. My husband never suspected anything. And what this shows is that she's still not getting it. She created a child with this man, kills the child, and then her only view on it is the child was sort of an exposition of the fact that she cheated. And so now that the child is gone, everything should be A-OK, and there is no reason for him to kill himself. Why should he have felt bad? So she's really not getting it. And in a certain way, she may deserve to be there more than them because of the degree of self-deception that she's involved in. Another thing that is absolutely central to her character and part of why the play actually works is because Estelle exists in the gaze and the desire of others, primarily men. And there's an early sort of flirtation that's taking place with Inez, which is part of why Inez is actually going to be so upset. This is part of the trap that's being laid for Inez. And she says to Inez that she exists in the eyes of others. Inez offers her a mirror. This is early on, and here we go. This is after they're supposed to be being quiet. Here we go. She asks, do you have a mirror? And Inez says, I think I do, in my purse. So she checks. But she doesn't. So she says, come on over here. I'll be your mirror. And she ends up telling Estelle that her makeup is a bit off and she likes it that way, all of those sorts of things. I'm not finding the exact passage, so I'll have to sort of summarize it. Here we go. She says to Inez, I feel so strange. Don't you ever get taken that way? When I can't see myself, I begin to wonder if I really and truly exist. I pat myself just to make sure, but it doesn't help much. And Inez says, I don't have that problem. I can't get away from my existence. I know what I'm like. I'm always conscious of myself in my mind, painfully conscious. And Garcin would probably say the same thing. And Estelle says, yes, in your mind. But everything that goes on in one's head is so vague, isn't it? It makes one want to sleep. I've got 6 big mirrors in my bedroom. There they are. I can see them, but they don't see me. They're reflecting the carpet, the settee, the window. But how empty it is, a glass in which I am absent. So what you've got here is somebody who knows that she exists and knows what she is only when it's being mirrored back to her. She needs the other to tell her what she is and how she is. She says, somehow it kept me alert, seeing myself as the others saw me. Without that, she can't really be sure what she's like. She says, Inez asks her, am I not nicer than your glass? And Estelle says, I don't know. You really scare me, rather. My reflection in the glass never did that, of course. I knew it so well, like something I had tamed. So what Estelle really wants is to be surrounded by others and by others who satisfy the kinds of desires that she has, one of the most basic of which is a rather narcissistic desire to be seen, to be affirmed. And she'll talk about this a little bit later on when she's able to see this young man who she didn't have an affair with, but was sort of leading on, and he's dancing with this other woman who was friends with her and him, and she her name's Olga, and he says they're dancing together. She can see what's going on, and he says. Inez says, "Who's Peter?" And Estelle says, "Such a silly boy, he called me his glancing stream. Just fancy, he was terribly in love with me. She's persuaded him to come out with her tonight." And why does this bother Estelle? She says, "He belonged to me. I had captivated him." She exists in the gaze, not just the gaze, but the desire of others, primarily men. This is why she's such a frustration for Inez, because she says, "Inez, you don't count. You don't matter. You're nothing. Because you can't give me what I want. That guy over there, though, he sure can." And a little bit later on, when he is, going through his qualms about, am I a coward, she says, or he also says, "Estelle, you must give me your trust." He's looking for a sort of spiritual connection to her. She says, "Oh, what a nuisance you are. I'm giving you my mouth, my arms, my whole body, and everything could be so simple. My trust, I haven't any to give. I'm afraid, and you're making me terribly embarrassed. Why can't we just exist, and be involved with this on the physical level? Don't you desire me? Just shut up. And let's, do what we're going to do." And eventually, he goes through his whole discussion of, am I a coward, am I not a coward? Inez says, "Estelle, do you like cowards?" And she says, "If you knew how little I care. Coward or hero, it's all one, provided he kisses well." A little bit later, as it turns out that she was kind of joking about that, but she really does have a sort of indifference about this. She says, "I'd love you just the same even if you were a coward. Isn't that enough?" She also says to him, you don't really have a coward's face or a coward's voice, and that's enough for me." So this is her character. She's not a sexpot. She's not just motivated by that. Really, she doesn't actually desire him so much as to be desired by him. And to reduce everything to that level, where she knows that she exists, where, paradoxically, it's safer for her. She's, in a certain way, even more damaged than Inez or Garcin are. Inez uses the language of traps, booby traps specifically, and Garcin uses the language of a spider's web, and both of these are actually apt for the situation that all three of these characters are placed within. And the traps exist not just within the structure of the room itself, but within each other and the structures of their desires, their attitudes, what it is that they've brought into the room with them. There's a number of solutions, sort of escape routes, that get sketched out, mostly by Garcin. As a matter of fact, it may be stretching it a bit to say that number 5, which is proposed by Inez, is actually an escape route. It's more just a modus vivendi, a way of living together that she proposes. One which, of course, he's not going to be able to find acceptable. And over and over and over again, what happens is one of these is proposed, and the people to whom they're proposed, it's mostly Garcin doing the proposing, will not be able to live with it. Will say, no, I can't, that's not what I want to do at all. And so over and over, each of the possible ways of making the situation not quite so bad, or even changing the situation, later on with some of the proposals that Garcin is making, they're not going to work. You notice as well that I don't have Estelle's proposed solution, which is just that she and Garcin should essentially get it on. Because it doesn't seem like she conceives of that as in the way that Garcin is a way out of hell. It's just in a certain way to pass the time or to make things work for this moment. So let's look at each of these in turn. The first one is just between Garcin and Inez when they both are in the room together before Estelle shows up. And Garcin proposes to her, "If I may venture on a suggestion, we should make a point of being extremely courteous to each other. This will ease the situation for us both." And Inez says, "I'm not polite." And then Garcin says, "Then I must be polite for two." So it seems like he's bending over backwards to make this work. And then the next thing Inez says is, "Your mouth." He says, "I beg your pardon? Can't you keep your mouth still? You keep twisting it about all the time. It's grotesque." And then she says, "That's what I reproach you with. There you are. You talk about politeness and you don't even try to control your face. Remember, you're not alone. You have no right to inflict the sight of your fear on me." So that's not going to work. Garcin can try to be courteous, but what looks like courteousness in his eyes does not look so in Inez's eyes, and she undermines it anyway, in part because of the cruelty that she exhibits. The second one is a bit more developed as a proposal, and Garcin suggests, once Inez says, "Here's the situation we're in, we're going to be torturous to each other," he says, "The solution's easy enough. Each of us stays put in his or her corner and takes no notice of the others. You here, and I there. Like soldiers at our posts. Also, we mustn't speak. Not one word. That won't be difficult. Each of us has plenty of material for self-communing. I could stay 10,000 years with only my thoughts for company." And Estelle says, have I got to be silent too? And he says, yes, and that way we will work out our salvation, looking into ourselves, never raising our heads. Agreed? And Inez says, agreed. And Estelle says, I agree. And he says, then goodbye. And almost immediately, Inez starts singing to herself. Estelle starts doing her makeup. And the ways in which they are communing with themselves turn out to be ways that are going to impinge upon the others. In particular, Estelle ends up asking, I wish I had a mirror. Do you have a mirror? And they start having this conversation back and forth, that flirtation that I talked about earlier. And unfortunately, Garcin cannot get away from that. He says, I asked you to leave me in peace, and I begged you not to speak, and it didn't work. A little bit later he says, for pity's sake, keep your mouth shut. Let's all sit down again quite quietly. We'll look at the floor, and each must try to forget the others are here. And this is where Inez says that famous set of lines that I mentioned earlier. To forget about the others? How utterly absurd. I feel you there in every pore. Your silence clamors in my ears. You can nail up your mouth, cut your tongue out, but you can't prevent your being there. Can you stop your thoughts? I hear them ticking away like a clock, tick-tock, tick-tock, and I'm certain you can hear mine. It's all very well skulking on your sofa, but you're everywhere, and every sound comes to me soiled because you've intercepted it on its way. You've even stolen my face. You know it, and I don't. I won't leave you in peace, she says. So, why won't she leave him in peace? Because even when he's proposing, we're each going to have our own little corners. That's not going to work. Human presence doesn't work that way. And for Sartre, human presence is always going to be viewed as kind of a threat, as an encumbrance to others. So then Garcin flips the scales, and he says, fine, have it your way. I suppose we were bound to come to this. They knew what they were about and that we're easy game. If they just put me in a room with men who can keep their mouths shut, but I'm stuck here with you, so let's be natural. And then he says, do you know I used to be mad about women and some were fond of me, so we may as well stop posing. We have nothing to lose. Why trouble about politeness and decorum and the rest of us? We're between ourselves and presently we shall be naked as newborn babes. And so this is where the revelations go. And they start, sort of tearing down some of the veils about who they are and why they're there. And it does make sense. Maybe that'll make us better able to live with each other. But that's precisely what reveals to them how hellish the existence with these other people are. Each of them realizes the others can see them for what they are, and they don't like that. And they're also seeing the others for the disgusting people that they are in turn. Garcin, strangely enough, proposes they should help each other. This is the fourth solution. He says, I suppose we start trying to help each other. And Inez says, I don't need help. Garcin says, Inez, they've laid their snare damn cunningly, like a cobweb. If you make any movement, if you raise your hand to fan yourself, Estelle and I feel a little tug. Alone, none of us can save himself or herself. We're linked together inextricably. So you can take your choice. So really what he's talking about there is something like solidarity. We're all in this together. We all need to think about how we're going to help ourselves and at the same time help each other out of this situation. And that doesn't work either. Inez asks, what do you expect me to do in return? And Garcin says, to help me. All it takes is a little effort, Inez, just a spark of human feeling. And then she says, human feeling? That's beyond my range. I'm rotten to the core. So, unless all three of them are willing to help each other, it's not going to work. And they're not. Inez makes it clear that she has pulled out of that possible solution. She proposes at a certain point, Garcin, if you just butt out, if you want to be by yourself, go ahead. Leave me and the girl alone, and we'll work out what we're going to do. She says, keep your pity for yourself. Don't forget, Garcin, there are traps for you too in this room, all nicely set for you. You do better to watch your own interests. But if you will leave us in peace, this child and me, I'll see I don't do you any harm. So what she's proposing is something like a truce. Like if he can stay over there and not interfere with the dynamic between the two of them, that she will not tear into him. She will refrain from that. That doesn't work either. Finally, there's two interesting solutions proposed by Garcin, first to Estelle and then to Inez. He proposes to Estelle, who is trying to essentially seduce him and to arouse his desire for her. He says, don't shrink away. Listen, I want you to do me a service. I know that it must seem strange to you having somebody ask you for help. You're not used to that. But if you make the effort, if you will only will it hard enough, I dare say we can really love each other. So love can be the way out of hell. Look at it this way. 1,000 of them are proclaiming I'm a coward, but what do numbers matter? If there's someone, just one person to say quite positively, I did not run away, that I'm not the sort who runs away, that I'm brave and decent and the rest of it, that one person's faith, so it's really not love, but faith, would save me. Will you have that faith in me? Then I shall love and cherish you forever, Estelle, will you? And Estelle says, oh, you silly man. Do you think I could love a coward? It's too late. She can't have that sort of faith in him because he's revealed to her that he is a coward. And she says, you don't have a coward's chin or a coward's mouth. And it's that stuff that I love about you. But by love, she just means she wants him to desire her, and she desires him. And he says, do you mean this? Really mean it? And she says, shall I swear it? And Garcin, getting very optimistic, says, then I snap my fingers at them, all those below and those in here, Estelle. We shall climb out of hell. And Inez laughs, and he says, what's that? Inez says, she doesn't mean a word of what she says. How can you be such a simpleton? Estelle, am I a coward? As if she cared a damn either way. And then she lets it, down. She says, what do you expect me to say? Don't you realize how maddening it is to have to answer questions one can't make head or tail of? She literally can't see what it is that Garcin is driving at with all this talk about love and faith, and she's at a lower level, you could say, spiritually, and she's not really ready for that. The last one, after after Garcin has gone through this long sort of seduction passage, and Inez and all of them have had a big fight, they actually try to throw Inez out of the door, because the door opens. And Garcin won't allow Estelle to push her out. Why not? Because he says, I need Inez. Because Inez and me actually have a lot more in common. He says, it's you who I have to convince. You are of my kind. Did you suppose I meant to go? No, I couldn't leave you here gloating over my defeat with all those thoughts about me running in your head. And Inez says, you're going to try to convince me that you're not a coward? And he says, I've got all eternity to convince you. That's the one and only thing I wish for now. It's you who matters. You who hate me. If you have faith in me, I'm saved. And Inez says, that's not going to be easy. I don't like you. As a matter of fact, I do hate you. I think you're a coward, and I'm a hard-headed woman. And he says, I'll give you all the time that's needed. And he says, this is something really important to me. I want to do this. And, she tears him down a bit more at that point. And she says, keep at it. It shouldn't be so hard convincing me. Pull yourself together, man. Rake up some arguments. Now you're going to pay the price. I'm really nothing. I'm just mere breath on the air. And yet you can't get out of me what it is that you desire. So all of these solutions, all of these attempts to get out of hell break down. And this leads us to the conclusion that hell is other people. And really, in order for it to work for Sartre, you need several people, all of whom can confute, can stymie each other's desires, their self-images, who can, refuse each other, who can use their freedom in such a way as to interfere with the freedom of the other person, who can tear the other person down. And so it's impossible to attain any sort of stable solution. If these two line up together and say, we're going to, be a team against you, they're stuck still in the presence of this other person. And Sartre, in his philosophy, seems to be saying, yes, that's actually the human condition. We're always, whether we realize it or not, stuck in this condition of having to deal with alien freedom, having to deal with the freedom, the choice, the way of looking at things of others, not being able to convince them, not even truly being sure of ourselves. And so the hell that he's describing, you might think of it as sort of penetrating further outward into the world of our own experience. This is a very dim view of things. Not all existentialists see it this way, but this is particularly and peculiarly Sartrean. And so this is why, to bring this to a conclusion, No Exit is such an important and emblematic piece of Sartrean literature.